Hi, everybody. There are bonds the eyes cannot see, yet the heart never forgets. The invisible thread quietly weaves its way through the fate of Tuan and Lytudiep, holding them together even when memories are lost and tears fall without reason. Though amnesia has erased names, faces, and shared moments, something deeper remains, pulling them closer with a pain they cannot explain. Lytudiep feels it in the sudden ache in her chest, in the way her heart races when Toan is near. Tuan feels it in the silence between them, where unfamiliar eyes still seem painfully familiar. Fate does not ask for permission. It binds souls in ways time and tragedy cannot undo. Despite the tears, despite the forgotten past, this invisible thread refuses to break, because some love is not remembered by the mind, it is remembered by the soul. There are days in life that look ordinary on the surface, quiet mornings, familiar paths, perpetual sounds, but somewhere beneath them, fate is already tightening its grip. The kind of day when the sky is neither too bright nor too dark, and the air feels heavy for no clear reason. That was the day the invisible thread between Toan and Lytudiep began to tremble again, after years of silence, amnesia, and tears that had never fully dried. Lytudiep woke before dawn, as she always did. The rooster had not yet crowed, but her body knew the hour. She sat up slowly, listening to the soft breathing of the old house, the distant hum of a motorbike passing on the village road. Life had taught her to wake early, to accept fatigue as a companion rather than an enemy. In the small kitchen, she boiled corn for breakfast, the steam fogging the window and blurring the outside world, much like her own future, unclear and fragile. As she ate, memories crept in uninvited, not clear images, but feelings, the warmth of someone's presence, the echo of a voice she could no longer fully remember, the strange ache that appeared whenever she passed the old banyan tree at the edge of the village. She never said his name out loud anymore, yet Tuan lived quietly in every corner of her days, in the pauses between breaths, in the way her heart tightened when the phone rang unexpectedly. Meanwhile, in a city far away, Tuan sat on the edge of a hospital bed, pressing his fingers against his temples. Doctors called it recovery. Friends called it a miracle. But Tuan knew something was missing. His life felt like a book with its first chapters torn out. He could remember numbers, faces, routines, but not the reason his chest hurt whenever he dreamed of a woman standing in sunlight, waiting. Every morning he asked himself the same question: who was she? And every morning his mind answered with silence. Back in the village, Lytudiep stepped onto the dusty road to work, joining other women whose lives were shaped by harvest seasons and aching backs. They talked about prices, weather, children, simple things that made the world feel manageable. Yet as she walked, she felt it again, that invisible pull, as if somewhere someone was thinking of her at the exact same moment. Fate rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it ties two souls together so tightly that even amnesia cannot sever the bond, only delay the moment they finally find their way back to each other. Life has a cruel way of moving forward even when hearts remain behind. Days continued to pass, one after another, steady and indifferent, as if nothing extraordinary were waiting to unfold. Yet beneath that calm rhythm, something unseen was slowly waking up, soft at first, like a memory stretching after a long sleep. In the hospital room, Tuan stared at the rain sliding down the glass window. The city outside looked blurred, distorted, much like his thoughts. The doctors said he was healing well, that his mind would eventually adjust, but no one could explain why certain moments made his chest tighten without warning. a familiar scent passing by in the hallway, a woman's laughter echoing from a television, a simple bowl of warm soup that reminded him of home, though he could not remember where that home was. One afternoon, a nurse accidentally dropped a stack of personal items onto his bed. Among them was an old wallet, worn at the edges, forgotten until now. As Tuan picked it up, something inside stirred. His fingers paused, hesitant, before sliding out a small photograph. It was faded, slightly bent, yet unmistakably important. A woman stood in the picture, her hair tied loosely, her smile gentle but strong. Behind her, fields stretched endlessly under a pale blue sky. Tuan's breath caught. His heart responded before his mind could. For reasons he could not name, his eyes burned and his hands trembled. "Who are you?" he whispered, though deep down he already knew she was not a stranger. At that same hour, Lytudiep was washing clothes by the river. The water was cold, biting her fingers, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts drifted, as they often did, to questions she never dared to ask aloud. Is he alive? Does he remember anything? Or have I already been erased from his world? She told herself she had learned to let go, yet her heart never truly agreed. As the sun lowered, she felt an unexpected chill. A strange sadness wrapped around her without reason, as if someone far away had just spoken her name for the first time in years. She looked up at the sky, blinking back tears she could not explain, blaming them on exhaustion. That night, Toan could not sleep. He held the photograph tightly, afraid it might disappear if he let go. Faces came and went in his mind, fragments without order, but her eyes stayed. They followed him into his dreams, into the silence between thoughts. Some bonds do not need memories to exist. They live deeper than logic, deeper than names. And as fate gently knocked on doors long closed, both Toan and Lytudiep felt it, an invisible thread pulling, reminding them that some hearts, once connected, are never truly apart. Morning arrived quietly, the way it always did, without asking whether anyone was ready. The city stretched awake, kettles whistled, motorbikes hummed, and life slipped back into its familiar rhythm. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, something extraordinary was unfolding, slow and irreversible, like a tide that never announces its return. Tuan began to notice the small things. He noticed how his hand hesitated when signing his name, as if another version of himself was watching from a distance. He noticed how certain streets felt warmer, safer, even though he had no memory of walking them before. Most of all, he noticed how the photograph never left his pocket. He carried it like a compass, though he did not yet know where it was pointing. At night, fragments of dreams visited him. A woman's voice calling his name in the rain, a pair of worn sandals placed neatly by a doorway, the smell of rice cooking over a simple stove. These were not grand memories, no dramatic scenes, no clear faces, just pieces of everyday life. And that was what frightened him the most. They felt real. They felt lived. Across town, Lytudiep was learning how to live with waiting. Waiting became her quiet habit, woven into her routine. She waited while sweeping the yard, while counting change at the small shop, while watching the sky darken at dusk. Sometimes she told herself she was no longer waiting for Tuan, only for peace. Yet every unfamiliar phone ring made her heart leap before disappointment gently pulled it back down.
One evening, as she closed the shop, a stranger passed by and asked for directions. His voice, calm and low, stirred something inside her. For a fleeting second, she almost called out a name that was not his. She smiled politely instead, embarrassed by her own weakness. Love, she had learned, does not vanish, it simply learns to hide. That same night, Tuan stood at the edge of a bridge, staring at the water below. He did not know why he was there. His feet had brought him without permission. The river flowed steadily, reflecting broken lights, much like his mind. And then it happened. A sudden rush of pain, sharp and overwhelming. His head throbbed, images collided, a woman crying, a promise spoken too late, his own voice, hoarse with regret. He gripped the railing, breath uneven. Diem. The name escaped his lips like a confession. Miles away, Lytudiep froze, her chest tightening as if the air had been pulled from the room. She pressed a hand over her heart, tears welling without warning. Somewhere between memory and destiny, two lives trembled at the same moment. The invisible thread had begun to pull harder, refusing to remain silent any longer.
The day they met again did not arrive with thunder or signs from the sky. It came quietly, disguised as an ordinary afternoon, the kind people forget as soon as it passes. The sun leaned gently toward evening, casting long shadows across the street, and life moved forward with its usual indifference. Children laughing, vendors calling out, footsteps passing without pause. Yet for Lytudiep, time seemed to slow, as if the world itself were holding its breath. She stood outside the small cafe where she often rested after a long day, her fingers wrapped around a warm cup of tea. Then she saw him. At first, she doubted her own eyes. The man across the street looked familiar in a way that hurt. His posture, the slight furrow in his brow, the way he paused before stepping forward, as if unsure of his right to be there. Her heart recognized him long before her mind dared to believe. Tuan stopped when he saw her. In that instant, everything he had struggled to remember no longer mattered. He did not need names or explanations. He only knew that this woman was the reason his chest had ached for months, the reason his dreams felt unfinished. The invisible thread between them, once thin and trembling, pulled tight at last. They stood facing each other, separated by only a few steps and 1,000 unspoken words. Lytudiep's eyes filled with tears, not from sadness alone, but from exhaustion, from carrying love without knowing where to place it. Tuan's voice trembled when he spoke, as if afraid that speaking might make her disappear. "I don't remember everything," he admitted softly, "but I remember how it feels to stand here, in front of you." Her tears fell freely now. She smiled through them, a fragile smile built from patience and pain. "Sometimes," she said, "remembering isn't about the past, it's about what you choose to do now." The weight of his mother's actions lingered between them, heavy and unresolved. Forgiveness was not a door that could be forced open. It was something that grew slowly, like trust, like healing. Tuan bowed his head, knowing the road ahead would not be easy, knowing love alone could not erase old wounds. But Lytudiep took a step forward. In that small movement was everything: fear, courage, hope. The crowd flowed around them, unaware that two lives were being rewritten in silence. Love, after all, does not always return with certainty. Sometimes it returns as a question. And that day, standing beneath an ordinary sky, Lytudiep and Tuan chose to walk forward together, not because fate demanded it, but because their hearts, at last, were brave enough to answer.